Culture is often described as the operating system of an organization. But what role does culture play in the boardroom? And how does it shape the way boards make decisions? Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. In this episode, Beth Albright, President and CEO of Saidia and a director on the board of the NACD Philadelphia chapter, speaks with NACD advisor Susan Paley. Together, they explore why board culture matters. They also discuss the board chair's role in managing dominant voices, how structured onboarding and so-called board buddies help reinforce cultural norms, and why even informal moments outside the boardroom can strengthen governance. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Beth Albright, I think none of us gets through a conversation without the word culture in our organizational discussions. Tell me, what is board culture? What does that really mean?
Board culture is like the norms, the behaviors, the assumptions that show how directors interact, they challenge, they decide, basically how they do their jobs.
Why does that matter? Can't we all just be stiff, a little bit robotic and move through things? Why are we worried about that happening?
Amongst everything else we have to deal with, why do we worry about culture, right? Because culture determines whether difficult issues are surfaced or whether they're avoided. Whether dissent is welcomed or it's kind of tamped down or suppressed. It also determines whether, management can be constructively challenged or deferentially accepted. It kind of creates the environment that the governance and the oversight that the board is responsible for is kind of like how they do that. So how you do that helps boards be more resilient and actually come up with better outcomes.
I have so many questions about how that comes to form. So we have a culture on a board. First of all, how solid and steady is it? Because we're constantly replacing directors, new folks at the board table. How does that become changeable versus solid in a board experience?
It's a constant management. I mean, it really is. You would do board assessments and, once a year do a focus, but every meeting either reinforces and supports the culture or it starts to degrade it. It can be things on who speaks first? Is there more of a dominant voice than the other? And while you are bringing on different people, onboarding is actually your opportunity to transfer the culture. It's a very nuanced protocol, so to speak. How are the directors showing up? Are they doing their pre-read? And if they don't, was that acceptable? Or did they kind of go, you didn't come prepared? And that's an expectation of this board. That is a cultural norm. So the way that the culture is reinforced or built is every meeting in all of the interactions between the board amongst themselves, between the chair and what he manages with the rest of the board, as well as their interactions with management.
So you discussed the responsibility sitting with the board as a whole and mentioned the chair's role. Who ultimately holds that responsibility at the end of the day for the culture being healthy or positive?
Ultimately, it's the full board itself, but practically speaking, I think it's the chair. Because the chair is the one who is responsible for calling out when something isn't right, having the side conversations, making sure that maybe some reticent voices are pulled forward and maybe some dominant voices are managed. They are the ones that help manage the agenda, the interactions with management, creating the space where dissent can be actively engaged, because that is a cultural norm, is can we dissent? Can we have a vigorous debate? If someone goes from debating an issue and making it personal, the board chair is usually the one, or the lead director. If the board chair is the CEO, they're kind of the same but a little bit different. The chair lead director is the one to kind of call them out and say, that's not acceptable here, and reinforce what a healthy culture for the board would be.
You just mentioned healthy culture, and earlier I snuck in a word, I don't know if it was correct or not, positive culture. Are we talking about the same thing? Is a healthy culture a positive culture by default?
No, we aren't. And I think some people want to make them the same. So positive culture is very congenial, very, go along to get along, but they're not necessarily doing the strategic oversight and the rigorous governance that is needed, because sometimes, we all come to these board meetings with a different lens or a different opinion. Sometimes you have to be able to raise that. So a positive is it can lead to kind of groupthink because everybody's okay and it's very nice. I'll put that in air quotes, very nice. But a healthy culture is one where you can have dissent, where you can have rigorous debate. You don't make it personal, because the ultimate outcome that everybody understands is in service to the business and the shareholders. So in order to have the best service and the strongest governance to the business and the shareholders is to have healthy debates, to be able to bring up questions, to press on certain issues that you might not agree with. But then ultimately you align around what the overall decision of the board is, and then you all support it.
I loved your moment of air quotes around nice. And what came up for me, we've read works by, Brene Brown saying clear is kind. And we think about the difference between kind and nice. Or we think about that book that was so popular years ago, Radical Candor, about the fact that we can be direct, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we can say the true thing and do it kindly, but it doesn't mean that it's the air quotes nice, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can disagree without being disagreeable. And there is a difference. And I think that's some of the things that you have to check each other on. Sometimes in the heat of the debate, you can degrade into become personal. And you say, nope, not acceptable. That is important, that it just reinforces it. And I think as you onboard new directors, and you'd help them see what the norms are. But when you onboard someone, there's the implicit and the explicit. The explicit is your rules, your bylaws, your regulations, your policies. I mean, that's all your explicit things that add to culture. But the implicit things are, helping people understand what are the expectations of the director? What are the expectations of the behavior in the room? Giving them, I like to call them a board buddy. Some people call them a mentor, but I like to call them a board buddy because mentor seems to imply a hierarchy, where a board buddy is you're the safe place that you can go and ask the question, can I fly first class to a board meeting? I mean, you don't want to ask the lead director that, but you want to know. So assigning a board buddy that becomes the safe haven for the person to understand, ask questions, and pressure test things that they are observing, especially if it's inconsistent with what they've been told. It's I was told that the culture was X, but as I sit in the meeting, I'm noticing Y, and having a place to be able to look at that. And then as you come onto a board, you can see who talks first, who is the first person called, who is assigned to subcommittees. And these all talk about the health of the board culture. I was put on audit. Nobody puts HR on audit. I was put on audit. I had a different lens. They didn't need me to be a financial expert, right? That speaks to a healthy culture where my lens mattered. I was also on comp, but I appreciate that. So all of these things.
I love the board buddy idea. Hats off to you for recognizing that board mentor means that somebody comes in with 30 years of seasoned experience. They don't want to be mentored necessarily with that word. But the board buddy creates, as you said, a safe haven. And if nothing else comes out of this podcast for our listeners, I hope that maybe they go back and suggest to their board that they introduce that concept. I'm a fan. I want to hop back to something you said a little earlier, which was about what happens if there's a domineering voice. And I think you alluded to the fact that the chair holds that responsibility, or the lead director. But I just wonder if you could help us drill down on that. There may be some listeners who are thinking secretly, yeah, I've got that in my boardroom. So how does that get addressed in a healthy manner?
If you have a domineering voice in the room and when they're done talking, nobody else speaks, like, silence becomes the aftermath, or you can feel a shift in the tone. You want the lead director to intervene real time, like to manage a dominating voice. I would suspect that anybody on a board is an effective leader, right? And so we all have learned how to manage difficult people, but you have to recognize it in the moment. Also establish kind of equal speaking norms. I was on a board where the lead director literally went, Beth, and I said my piece. And if I started to repeat myself, he'd shut it down and he'd go to the next person. It was like assembly line. But we all knew that we were going to get a chance, whether you wanted it or not. There's other boards that I've been on where it's a little bit more fluid. And then also, I think it's responsible for them to go and do private feedback, because sometimes people don't actually know that they're dominating the room. They might be passionate about it, but that personal passion may come across as aggressive. And so being able to hold up that mirror and helping them see how the impact lands in the room, I think is, an important coaching from the lead director. And then, you can always use the formal board evaluations to give candid feedback.
You just talked about holding up a mirror when someone doesn't realize that passion can come across as aggression. And it makes me think that so often the interpretation is subjective. What you thought was someone making a strong point, to me, could have been intimidating, or vice versa. And I guess that's where we use our buddies to have a private word and test something out, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was on a team, an executive team, that we had people were very passionate, just generally. And we created a vocabulary that was like, is this like a tombstone? I'm like, you're going to die over this? Or is this just kind of like a boulder where you can move it? Or is it just kind of like a notion that you're throwing around? Because I can't differentiate how married to this you are. And so it allowed us to be able to identify. It's like, I'm going to give you like a passionate plea here, but just know it's really more of a notion, or it's really, I'm like ready to die on the sword for this one. So you could gauge it, because you can't always gauge from people's intonation.
I was listening back in my mind some of what we just talked about, and I heard us dropping some hints around positive or healthy culture. I'll use the word healthy now, and some around what we wish wouldn't happen. I just want to make sure we have a bit of a list going in our head. So are there characteristics that you would say are usually present when there's a healthy board culture? And conversely, what red flags would people look out for if they're making a list of the, I'm not sure that this is healthy?
I think for healthy cultures, a couple framings is it focuses on the issue, not on the emotion, but it focuses on the issue or the outcome. You can separate governance from management. The reason that this is a concern is framed through a governance lens versus operational or management. As I've mentioned before, you can disagree, but you don't get personal. Those are all signs of healthy culture and the ability to have that rigor and those interactions, again, because you all believe that your experiences and your voice are in service to the company and to your shareholders. That's your guiding star. That's your North Star. And how you behave to get there, you can tweak along the way. In unhealthy cultures, people are side lobbying. They're doing these hallway conversations. It turns more into advocacy, or they dig their heels in. They're not open to listening. They're not hearing other people. They interrupt each other. All of that is not healthy. In some ways, you can kind of reset that, in my opinion, is you can just pause. You can just kind of take a breath before there's any response. You can reframe some of their comments as a question. It's like, okay, so what I hear you saying is X, right? You can kind of reframe it and bring it back to what is the issue. It's personal. You can just kind of re-anchor and say, our responsibility as board directors is, and kind of re-ground it into what are you supposed to be doing and why are you having this conversation. Sometimes it really does require a private intervention.
As I was making notes about your suggestions, I jotted down, universally powerful tools around the power of the pause, of reframing, of re-anchoring in our purpose. And I thought, great, that sounds really good for anything, personal relationships or meetings that aren't in the boardroom. What otherwise came up for me was this. You mentioned an unhealthy board meeting or board culture might involve people talking over each other and down. And I thought, oh, if that's happening at a board level, I wonder what's happening in the organization itself for people who don't have a lead director to lean upon to sort out the culture.
And that's a great point because management is in the room with you, right? So the executive team is also watching your interactions. So we've really focused on the board and the culture of the board and how we interact with each other. But let's not forget, you have the executive team there with you. And the executive team is watching and they're assessing and they're taking cues because you might have a new CFO. You may have a new executive or a first-time CEO, and they're going to take cues from the board and how they treat each other kind of sets a tone. You know, the tone at the top. NACD is big. Tone at the top. And so you are being watched. It's like being a parent. Like the kids are watching. They are, and they should be. And how we interact with each other and how we interact with management matters. It really does.
What you're saying makes so much sense about taking a beat and reframing. And when I think about that, I think, yes, that makes sense for the interior dialogue within the boardroom. Can you share a little more about the ripple effect of culture in the boardroom beyond what's happening in that discussion, but to the effective governance practices of that board, how they can be most accretive to the long-term success and strategy of that organization due to the culture they create?
I think it makes the committees more effective. If you have a healthy culture, then you trust, and I will pause on that word trust, you trust your fellow board members to be doing the heavy lifting that goes on in the committees. And you trust that they will bring forward issues that need to be held at the full board. And it is okay if you are not part of that. And same thing with the interactions with management, that everybody feels like we have a role to play, but I trust that my teammate, because you're really a team, is doing what they're supposed to be doing such that the whole entity continues to move forward with good governance, strong strategy, and positive business performance. But it's not just in the full board, it's how the committees interact in the smaller groups. And it's a bit amplified in the smaller groups. And you can do a lot of good, you could do a lot of harm.
I think in my head, you took us out of the boardroom for a minute because those committees might meet offline, offsite. And that made me think about culture and how it's formed outside of the board meetings. I know people famously have a board dinner the night before they go into the meeting. They may go on a field trip to visit a plant. Can you talk a little bit about how the activities we're doing as board members, either with each other offline to have a coffee or otherwise, builds the board culture?
It's funny, when you go to visit a plant, how you interact with the workers. Do you spend time with them, or are you just breezing in and breezing out and, it's like a photo op? That matters. And I personally would love to spend a full day at a facility. But there are little interactions. So I know for me, there was one board member. He was a big music person. I'm not. But I knew he was. And whenever I would hear like this funky new thing, I would send him a little clip. I said, hey, Michael, I was thinking of you. I heard this, right? I don't know if he liked it or not. I don't know. But you start to see each other as colleagues, as friends. So when you do have a disagreement, when you do have some hard crisis things you have to work through, you trust they're showing up the way you want it to be, but you give each other a little bit of dispensation because you've learned who they are as a person. We all show up as a human being. We all show up with our own baggage, with our own experiences, and with our own thoughts and ideas. And so you build these not in the board meetings, because the board meetings are episodic. It's when you have the committee meetings. It's when you see something and you know that your colleague or your fellow board member would appreciate seeing that. When you know that, sadly, we're all a little bit older. We all have like health issues. It's like, hey, how did this procedure go? I was thinking about you. Like you treat them as human beings so that when you're in the trenches together, you feel like you have each other's back, even if you don't agree. And I am a huge fan of the night before meeting, before you go into the board meeting, where you can all say, hey, I read the material. I have some questions, I have some concerns, and we can all raise it in the safety of it's kind of like an executive session, but we can kind of say, here was my impression of the information, and here's my concerns, and how are we going to manage through this? So you have a little bit of a game plan when you go into the full board meeting with management watching.
That is so helpful, Beth. I picked out of there a lot of useful tips. One of them was that the words that you're speaking about board relationships, of course, ring true for everything, for all the other activities and interactions in our life, that we build trust and can extend grace to the other folks when we remember, oh, they're human. So we've done this podcast on a number of topics across the couple of years we've been doing it. And inevitably, the conversation comes back to relationship and how we're talking about humans, whether it's governance or whether it's specific issues, regulatory. So I just really appreciate that you've spoken about that. And what comes up for me is the question of doing a dipstick check, like when we check our oil to see where it is. Like, we want to make sure that we don't just think we have a good culture, but actually everyone around the board table also thinks that we have a strong, healthy culture. So you mentioned that one of the vehicles for reinforcing this is the annual surveys or self-assessments. Is that typical? Do we want to do it more frequently than annual? Do we bring someone else in to check our culture? How does that happen?
First of all, I want to just underscore giving each other grace. We should all give each other a little more grace just in life in general. And you're right, Susan, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about isn't unique and confined to the boardroom. It really isn't. I love that. But, on a board assessment, annually at a minimum, my opinion, formally annually at a minimum, informally every meeting, you can say, how did the meeting go? You can just kind of give each other some feedback. It doesn't take very long, but again, it becomes part of your normal cadence to say, how did we do? Like, how did we as a board do? Some effective tools, you can use a third-party facilitator to do evaluations. I think kind of really doing a deep dive every 2 to 3 years is amazing. Just a little plug for NACD's business advisory services. They definitely help with board evaluations. You can do 360s, you can do deeper. Again, creating that third-party neutral place to go. You can do anonymous surveys, peer feedback. You've got executive session feedbacks, like I mentioned earlier. The most honest assessments come through structured interviews. They really do, versus what a lot of us use are check the box questionnaires, scale of 1 to 5, whatever. They're easy and they're easy to collate. They're easy to put data together and say, order of magnitude, how are we doing? But if you really want to do an assessment of how is the board and the culture, it really comes through in structured interviews. You have to have the conversation.
100% I agree in my experience. And I would add to that people sometimes are hesitant to speak truth through keyboard. Mm-hmm. And when they have a human in front of them, it's a little more nuanced.
Yeah, it is always nuanced. And you can have, a skilled assessor can say, so I heard you say this, let's pull on that. Like you've done with me. It's like, you mentioned this, how about you hear things, you can hear the intonation, you can look at them and you can see how they're reacting. So yeah, it's important. And if you really do care, you will move beyond just the check the box. And the check the box is fine, maybe once a year, but every couple of years, go deep and see how you're doing. And are you fulfilling your fiduciary responsibilities to the shareholders in your governance?
There's your North Star. I loved everything you said. One thing caught on my brain, and I want to bring it back to us. After every meeting, informally saying, how'd we do? How'd that meeting go? So I'm just imagining I'm a new director or maybe even a seasoned director in that seat and in front of 11 colleagues. I'm going to push back at the chair and say something negative. I wonder, how effective is that? What came up for me is that would the chair ever ask deliberately for feedback that was constructive, like, hey, what do you wish we would start, stop, and continue? Or something that prompts them to have to answer something constructive. What do you see in your experience?
I love the start, stop, continue. I mean, it's kind of a safe haven and framing for things. And a new director, you're right, Susan, it probably isn't going to be like, oh, it's fine. I'm still learning. I don't want to, get on the wrong side. Yeah. But if you have a healthy culture and you have one that allows you to say, hey, I thought we could do better here. That's what you want. And kind of the way you have a healthy culture is that the meetings are a little bit shorter. They're more punchier, like not punchy, like aggressive, but you can get through some things versus meetings that are long with lots of presentations and not a lot of decisions. It's like, are we focusing on the right things? And so you can just say, did we focus on the right things? Did we have the right conversations? And you can kind of shake your head. You don't even have to say anything versus giving some concrete examples. But yeah, I think it's important that it becomes normalized to be able to give each other feedback and say, we collectively, how are we doing? Before you get to the evaluations. And then there's always going to be, some side conversations And I think that's also another cultural norm is, do you allow meetings before and after the meetings? Do you allow the hallway conversations? And that's a tough one.
Whether it's hallway conversations or in the boardroom, having that courage to speak up. I know that we've used in this discussion the word safe haven. We haven't raised another phrase that I'm going to drop in here, which is the phrase psychological safety, which we've heard in the past few years in the workplace. What role does that play in board culture?
It's important because people have opinions. If you do not create the space for their experience and view to be raised up because they feel like they will be demeaned, degraded, talked over, shut down, you lose the value that you hired a director to be on your board for. That's what you've done, is you've spent a lot of time and effort to find a director that you believe will enhance your board. And if they don't have the psychological safety to bring their voice forward, you have degraded value for the board, for the company, and you've lost opportunities. So the psychological safety, you have to invest in it. You have to avoid dismissive language. Again, it's that nuance we talked about earlier, Susan. But the psychological safety, making people believe, and I'll go back to trust. I trust if I say this, it will be okay, even if it's not popular.
Before we wrap our conversation, there's something I'm curious about that I want to get to in the work that one does before one joins a board. We're talking about an established board culture that you're already sitting on. If I'm getting invited onto a board of directors and I'm doing my due diligence, how can I sniff out what the board culture is and whether it will be productive or if it'll be damaging, if it'll be healthy or not?
I think it's hard because you're not sitting and watching, but I think most times when you are interviewing, you will, at some point, you will likely be in a room with the lead director, the chairs of the comp, the audit, the nom-gov, right? And then maybe the CEO, maybe management is not in the room at the time. But at some point, you will likely be together with all that. And then pay attention. Pay attention to how they interact with each other, how, the cadence. And then you can explicitly ask, could you please describe your culture? And maybe if you are not in a room with everybody, you can ask each of them individually and you could see, do their answers align? Whatever the culture is, right? They're like, we're really aggressive. Okay. Well, if everybody says we're really aggressive, then that's probably their culture. But if there's alignment across answering that question, then that probably is pretty true. If there is not alignment to the answers, it should be a cause for pause. I'm not saying a red flag, but it should be a cause for pause in which to dig a little bit deeper.
Because that's information by itself, right?
It's information by itself. Exactly. And I think it's okay to ask about culture. I think boards would be impressed if you did.
Culture is so critical. We know that, but sometimes it can be very intangible, very amorphous, and you've really helped us to think through it with some more tangible mindset and tools. So a million thanks to you. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Absolutely. And Susan, it's interesting. Investing in culture, it isn't just soft governance. It really is about being the best board director you can be. So thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. It was a pleasure to go through it with you.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.